She was a billionaire on the edge of losing everything. He was just the janitor, or so they thought. In just 3 seconds, he saved her company. And what she did next silenced an entire boardroom. But behind his quiet eyes was a story no one dared to ask. Before we begin this unforgettable journey of dignity, second chances, and the kind of love that grows in silence, make sure to hit subscribe and join us as we uncover the hidden heroes among us. The boardroom was in chaos. Voices collided like crashing waves, panicked, loud, each desperate to be the one with a solution. But no one had one. The numbers were brutal. Crystal Tech's stock had plummeted overnight. A data breach, followed by a regulatory freeze, had paralyzed operations. $30 billion in projected revenue, gone. Investors were pulling out. Employees were posting resumes. Journalists circled like vultures. At the head of the table sat Allison Ward, 38, CEO, calm in posture, but unraveling beneath the surface. Her tailored navy suit still screamed power, but the light in her steel blue eyes flickered like a dying star. She stared at the massive screen displaying the financial reports, silent, motionless. Behind her, a janitor pushed a mop. He moved quietly, like a shadow, careful not to disturb the meeting. His name tag read Harris. Faded USMC tattoo peeked from beneath his sleeve. His eyes scanned the screen. His steps slowed. No one noticed him. No one ever did. Except today. Because Harris stopped mopping and spoke. "That line there," he said, voice low, even. "It's wrong." Silence dropped like a bomb. Heads turned. Disbelief spread like wildfire across the room. Allison arched a brow. "Excuse me?" He stepped forward, pointing at the third quarter line item. "You've been double counting intangible assets from the quantum licensing deal. The projected revenue spike isn't real. It's a loop error from the old ledger you merged. That spike? It's a ghost. But the underlying tech, it's real. Just undervalued." No one moved. No one breathed. Allison narrowed her eyes. "Who are you?" He met her gaze with the kind of calm that couldn't be faked. "I'm the night janitor," he said, "and a former financial medic with the Marines. I've seen worse messes patched in combat zones with half a spreadsheet and a satellite phone." A beat passed, then another. Allison turned slowly toward the CFO. "Is he right?" The CFO blinked, scrambled with trembling hands over his keyboard, recalculating. 5 seconds. 10. Then, "My God," he whispered, "he's absolutely right." The air shifted. It was as if the entire building leaned in. Suddenly, the financial cliff they had all braced for had a ledge. Not a complete rescue, but a thread, a truth, something to work with. And all of it had come not from Wall Street, but from the mop bucket in the corner. Allison stood. She walked toward Harris, slowly, heels clicking on the marble floor like drumbeats. Her gaze never left his. "You just saved Crystal Tech from a catastrophic decision," she said quietly. "In 3 seconds. He didn't reply. "You could have said nothing." "I don't stand by when things are burning," Harris said simply. Something shifted in her expression. Respect, confusion, and something else she hadn't felt in years. Awe. She looked at the board, still frozen in shock, then back at the man before her. "I should call legal," she murmured. "Set up some kind of consulting contract. Retainer." But then she did something not even she expected. She said, "Or maybe I should just marry you." The room burst into gasps and stunned laughter. But Allison wasn't smiling. She was serious. Harris blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I'm serious," she said. "You just showed more clarity, courage, and ethics than anyone I've employed at sea level. In 3 seconds. You don't need a desk. You need a stake. If I'm going to rebuild this company, I don't want a savior. I want a partner." Silence again. But this time, electric. Harris shook his head, slowly. "You don't even know me." "Then give me a reason to," she said. "Say yes." He met her eyes. There was no flirtation in his, just a calm honesty, deep and steady. "I have a daughter," he said finally. "She's 9. Her name's Alara." She's why I mop floors instead of working Wall Street." Allison didn't flinch. "I like her already." The room stared at them like a scene in a dream, one where the world turned upside down. But for once it felt right. In the hallway, after the boardroom emptied in a stunned haze, Harris walked beside Allison. She handed him a badge. Consultant, Access, Level 7. He stared at it. "I'm not marrying you," he said dryly. She smirked. "Yet." He cracked a smile, just a flicker. And for the first time in weeks, Allison felt the weight on her chest lift, just a little. Because in 3 seconds, she hadn't just saved her company. She might have just found someone worth rebuilding it for, 2 months earlier. Long before the boardroom gasps and billion-dollar headlines, Harris moved through the dim hallways of Crystal Tech like a shadow. Quiet, efficient, invisible. He arrived before dawn. Always the first. Not because he had to, but because silence gave him space to think. The corridors still smelled of freshly printed reports and cold steel, untouched by the buzz of executives and analysts. It was during these early hours that Harris did his real work, not just cleaning, but observing, listening. He noticed everything. The patterns, the behaviors, the arrogance, but he never judged. Because Harris knew something they didn't. Real value isn't loud. It's quiet. Like integrity, like duty. He wore his faded USMC jacket under the janitor's apron, not for nostalgia, but because the weight of the cloth reminded him of who he used to be. Once a Marine, once a battlefield strategist known for solving problems under fire, now a janitor, voluntarily, not because he couldn't get another job, but because he had chosen a different mission. Her name was Alara, 9 years old, bright as a supernova and painfully shy. She was why he scrubbed toilets instead of crunching numbers on Wall Street, why he turned down high-paying offers from defense contractors who wanted his mind but didn't care about his soul, why every evening at 6 p.m. sharp, no matter what, he dropped the mop and walked 5 blocks home to a tiny, rent-controlled apartment that smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Because Ilara would be waiting, at the window, watching. Their world was small, but whole. The apartment was modest. 2 rooms, cracked tiles, creaky floors. But it had everything that mattered. A bookshelf overflowing with languages, Spanish, Farsi, Japanese, Swahili, not his books. Hers. Alara was a quiet prodigy. She could read at 3, speak 4 languages by 5, and by 9 could interpret the tone of someone's silence better than most adults could understand words. But she rarely spoke. Not because she couldn't, because she listened more than she needed to talk. When she did speak, her voice was soft, like wind through leaves, and always measured, like each word had been pre-approved by her heart before passing through her lips. They had a routine. In the mornings, Harris made her oatmeal with a swirl of honey, packed her lunch with a note in a different language each day. Alara, in return, would leave sticky notes on the fridge. "Papa, today I spoke 3 new words in Japanese. Guess which ones?" He never guessed right, but that was the point. They weren't rich, but they were never poor. Not where it counted, because kindness filled the space between them like sunlight through old windows. At Crystal Tech, Harris remained unnoticed by design. He moved between glass walls and buzzing screens like a ghost in boots. He listened, sometimes to complaints, sometimes to market strategies, often to silence, the kind that said more than words. That's how he pieced together the cracks forming in the company. He didn't mean to, but to a man trained to notice mines in desert sands, blind spots in billion-dollar firms were child's play. He kept it to himself. Until one day, he wouldn't. But for now, he swept floors. One evening, as Harris walked home, he stopped by the second-hand bookstore tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered diner. He pushed open the door. The bell above jingled softly. "Mr. Harris?" The old woman behind the counter greeted him. "Back for more treasure?" He smiled. Something in Arabic this time. Alara's been obsessed since last week's documentary. She handed him a thin book with faded gold lettering. He paid in cash. The cover was cracked, but the ink still sang. At home, Elara squealed, softly of course, when she unwrapped the book. She held it like a holy artifact. That night, they read together by the window, sharing lines by candlelight when the bulb above flickered. Outside, the city rumbled on. Inside, time stood still. "Why do people shout when they're angry?" Elara asked suddenly, her eyes not leaving the page. Harris paused. "Because they're scared," he said gently. "Scared no one will hear what they really mean." Elara nodded slowly. "I don't want to be like that." "You're not," he said. "You're stronger." And she was. Stronger than most CEOs he'd seen meltdown in boardrooms. Stronger than politicians he'd protected on deployment. Stronger even than he had been at her age, when the world still felt like a fight. She was the reason he believed in softness as a form of strength. The next morning, Harris found a note in his lunch pail. "You're my favorite hero, even if the world can't see your cape. E." He folded it carefully and placed it inside the lining of his wallet where war medals used to rest. No medal ever meant as much. But outside their tiny world, Crystal Tech continued to crumble. Whispers of instability, frantic investors, data that didn't add up. And still, Harris mopped, listened, calculated. He saw the avalanche coming long before it hit. And when it did, he'd be ready. Because sometimes the quiet man in the shadows isn't hiding. He's preparing. It was a Sunday morning, painted in soft gold. The kind of light that made the city forget it ever held pain. Central Park stirred with gentle life. Joggers tracing old paths. Young couples sipping coffee on weathered benches. Squirrels darting through leaves like secrets with tails. And in the heart of it all stood a girl in a white cotton dress. A little too still for a child. A little too aware. Elara, 9 years old, hands clasped in front of her, eyes scanning the paved path like a map only she could read. Beside her, Harris sipped coffee from a cracked thermos, his veteran's jacket zipped just enough to keep out the breeze, his attention split between the chessboard set up on a park table and the rhythm of his daughter's silence. He never had to ask what she was thinking. He just waited long enough, and she'd let the world know in her own way. Then it happened. A commotion, subtle to most, deafening to her. An elderly man, perhaps late 70s, gray scarf flapping like a surrender flag, spun in circles by the fountain, panic rising in his wrinkled face. He held a crumpled map in one hand and kept muttering, his voice desperate. No one stopped. People glanced. Some smiled apologetically and walked on. But not Elara. She stepped forward quietly, like someone entering a sacred space. Her voice, gentle and melodic, rose in flawless Italian. "Mi scusi, ha bisogno di aiuto. Posso accompagnarla?" "Excuse me, do you need help? I can walk with you." The old man froze. His eyes lit up, as if he'd heard a familiar lullaby after years of silence. "Dio mio, tu parli italiano?" "My God, you speak Italian?" She nodded shyly. "My papa taught me to listen with my heart first." And just like that, she took his arm, small hand in trembling elbow, and they walked. 10 minutes. That's all it took for the ripple to begin. Unbeknownst to Elara, someone had been watching. Across the park, Marie Dawson, an operations associate at Crystal Tech, sat on a bench with a novel in one hand and an eye on the unusual girl with an old soul. Marie had seen the janitor before. Quiet, kind, always punctual, always invisible. But this wasn't janitorial. This was something rare. She followed them at a distance, out of curiosity more than suspicion, watched as the girl pointed to signs, translated street names, explained landmarks, all in Italian. The elderly man wiped his eyes before saying goodbye, and Elara bowed her head gently in parting. Marie scribbled something in the margin of her book. Janitor's daughter speaks perfect Italian. Back at the chess table, Harris had watched the whole exchange from a distance, one hand resting on a knight he never moved. As Elara returned, he didn't greet her with applause or overpraise, just a quiet nod, a small smile, as if to say, "I saw you. I'm proud." She sat beside him, picking at the corner of the table. After a while, she whispered, Was it okay that I helped him? Harris didn't answer immediately. He moved a pawn forward slowly, then said, You didn't help him to be seen, Alara. You helped because it was right. That's the kind of light the world remembers. She looked up. But some kids at school say, if you're good and no one sees it, it doesn't count. Harris turned to her then, soft but firm. Real light doesn't come from a stage, sweetheart. It comes from the heart, and hearts don't need spotlights to shine. Alara sat with that, let it soak in, nodded once, and Harris knew she understood. That night, back at their small apartment, she wrote a note. Dear Papa, maybe I'll never be famous, but I hope I'll always be kind. E. She folded it into a paper crane and placed it on his pillow. He found it later and tucked it beside the note she'd written the week before. That made 2 now, stacked in the wallet that once held mission orders and battlefield maps. The next morning at Crystal Tech, Marie Dawson pulled her supervisor aside in the break room. Listen, she began cautiously, I saw something yesterday in the park. The janitor's kid, she's something else. You need to see this. The supervisor raised an eyebrow. What? She clean better than him? Marie shook her head. She speaks 5 languages, maybe more, and not just parrot style. I mean, really speaks them. With warmth. With understanding. The supervisor scoffed, but Marie continued. Maybe the dad's more than he lets on. Maybe we've been walking past a story worth hearing. And just like that, the first whisper of Alara's quiet gift began threading its way through the halls of Crystal Tech. Not loud, not forced, but curious. And as Harris mopped the marble floors later that week, he felt it. A shift. People who used to ignore him nodded. Some even smiled. A few paused. Looked like they wanted to say something, but didn't. And Harris, being Harris, said nothing back. He just kept working. Head down. Steady hands. Because he knew how the world worked. Kindness didn't need applause. It needed consistency. What he didn't know, what no one could know, was that Alara's simple act of helping a stranger had just started a chain reaction. One that would eventually lift an empire from the ashes, heal wounds far older than her age, and show the world what real light looked like. Not the kind that blinds, the kind that guides. The doors shuddered with a groan, then halted. A flicker, a sudden jolt. And just like that, the humming noise of the Crystal Tech executive elevator gave way to an eerie mechanical silence. Darkness enveloped the cabin, thick, absolute, before the dim emergency lights blinked on, casting long shadows across the small space. Allison froze, one manicured hand instinctively reaching for the control panel. She jabbed the buttons. Lobby, open, any floor. Come on. Nothing. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't afraid of many things. Power, lawsuits, being quoted out of context. But small, enclosed spaces where she couldn't control the outcome, that was a different beast. She turned, and that's when she saw him. Harris, leaning quietly in the corner. Calm. Still. Holding a janitor's cart with a bucket, a mop, and a folded towel slung over one broad shoulder. He didn't flinch. Didn't reach for buttons. Didn't curse. Just stood there, like the darkness had no authority over him. Of all the people to be stuck with. Allison let out a sigh. Great, of course. Harris looked at her, just once, then returned his gaze to the closed doors. You okay? He asked, voice steady as a mountain. She blinked. I'm fine, just annoyed. Pause. Then, as if forced by boredom or discomfort, she added, You're the janitor, right? Some days, he replied simply. That answer threw her for a second. She crossed her arms. You either are or you're not. Harris shrugged slightly. I mop floors, fix light bulbs. Sometimes I carry boxes. Sometimes I get asked to fetch coffee. So yeah, I guess I'm the janitor. There was no sarcasm in his tone, no trace of bitterness, only a quiet acceptance layered with something she couldn't quite place. Strength? No. Discipline. She shifted her weight. The silence pressed in. Well, I'll have to send a strongly worded email to facilities. This elevator's been overdue for inspection." He didn't respond. She stole another glance at him. The emergency lights hit the sharp angles of his face, cheekbones dusted with age and grit, jawline unshaved but not unkempt, eyes calm like still water in a war zone. There was a heaviness to him, not the kind that slouched, but the kind that had carried things others couldn't. Curiosity stirred against her better judgment. "How long have you worked here?" she asked, eyes narrowing. "Almost a year," he said. "You always this quiet?" "Only when no one's asking real questions." That one landed. She arched a brow. "And what would a real question be, Mr. Harris?" "All right then, Harris. What's a real question?" He turned to her slowly. "In a world full of noise, the real question isn't what people say. It's what they listen for." She stared at him. "That's cryptic." "It's honest." There was a beat. Then she chuckled. "You talk like you've seen things." "I have." "Like what?" A long pause. Then gently, "Things people don't come back from. And some things they do, but they leave pieces of themselves behind." The air shifted, a cold draft from nowhere. "Military?" she asked, this time without mockery. He nodded once. "Which branch?" "Marine Corps." Allison folded her arms again, but this time not out of defensiveness. "You served?" "I still do. Just not in uniform." There was that quiet conviction again. What does that even mean? Harris looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time she didn't feel like a CEO being assessed. She felt like a person. It means service doesn't end when the war does. It just changes shape. Some of us still fight, just with mops instead of rifles, silence instead of orders, dignity instead of rank. Allison's throat tightened. She leaned back against the wall of the elevator, her voice softer now. "You ever lose someone out there?" Harris's gaze dropped, just for a moment. "Too many." Silence stretched between them, this time not awkward but sacred. A moment of shared humanity in the strangest of places. She studied him, this man whose name she never bothered to learn, whose face she likely passed by a dozen times without recognition. Now, locked in a metal box with no cell signal and no assistant, she was seeing him for the first time. And he wasn't small, not even close. "You know," she said after a long beat, "you talk like someone who should be in charge of a company, not cleaning it." He smiled, not with pride, but with understanding. "I don't need to run the world to make a difference in it." And that hit her like a bell. For the first time in weeks, she felt a crack in her own armor. The exhaustion, the weight of being the one everyone expected answers from, the pressure to always have a plan, a solution, a persona. Here, in the dark, she was just a woman, and he was just a man. But somehow she felt smaller than him, and safer. The elevator jolted, then hummed, lights flickered back to full brightness. The doors slowly opened. Allison blinked at the sudden light as if waking from something deeper than sleep. She stepped out, heels clicking softly, then paused, turned back. "You have a daughter, don't you?" Harris tilted his head, slightly surprised. "How'd you know?" She gave a half smile. "Because only people with someone to live for speak like you do." Then she walked away, and for the first time in a long time, Harris stood in an empty elevator and let himself exhale. The night shift at Crystal Tech was a silent opera of lights, machines, and echoes. When the last executive's door clicked shut and the corridors emptied of their confident strides and clacking heels, Harris began his real work, not just cleaning floors, but observing a world that never truly slept. By midnight, the top floor resembled a polished museum of ambition, glass walls glinting like sharp ideas, whiteboards frozen mid-genius, and desktops glowing with forgotten data. Harris moved quietly between rooms, mop in hand, eyes calm. But beneath that stillness lived a mind that refused to turn off. He wasn't snooping. He wasn't curious for power or gossip. But patterns. Patterns had always spoken to him. On the battlefield, patterns saved lives. In civilian life, they told quieter truths. And now, night after night, a whisper kept calling to him. Not of voices, not of people, but of numbers. It started with a screen left on in conference room C. Harris had passed it by a dozen times, never glancing twice until a tiny inconsistency blinked at him. It was a cost projection chart. He paused. The margin lines didn't align with the asset column. There was a 0.7% shift, not enough to raise a red flag, but enough to bother a man who'd once calculated the distance of an enemy's mortar in the desert by the sound delay of its echo. He leaned closer, opened the Excel file, just to look. 3 minutes later, he closed it. Didn't save anything, didn't even change the view. But something stayed with him. A ripple, a subtle imbalance. Over the next few weeks, it happened again. A quarterly forecast left open. A procurement report still printing when he entered. A budget draft thrown carelessly into the recycle bin. Harris never sought them out. They found him, like scattered puzzle pieces, whispering, "Something isn't right." So he started writing things down. Not in a dramatic way, no spy games, no accusations. Just a worn leather notebook he kept in his janitor cart, nestled under the clean towels and a backup mop head. Row after row of quiet discrepancies. Numbers with slight misalignments. Vendor totals that didn't match product counts. Department costs that edged upward without explanation. He never showed them to anyone. He never planned to, but he recorded them, methodically, carefully, not out of suspicion, but out of a sense of quiet duty. Because in his world, truth mattered, even when no one was watching. At home, Alara noticed the changes first. "You've been writing more," she said one morning as he packed her lunch. He glanced up. "Just thoughts." She nodded, unconvinced. "Thoughts that look like spreadsheets." He chuckled. "Maybe. Just numbers talking." "Are they whispering something important?" she asked with that uncanny wisdom only she seemed to possess. Harris looked at her. "They might be. Or maybe I'm just listening when no one else is." She sipped her orange juice, swung her legs under the table, and said softly, "You always listen better than most people talk." That stayed with him all day. One evening, long after the last meeting had ended, Harris found himself in the executive copy room, changing out a toner cartridge. Beside the machine was a discarded binder, half-shredded printouts. He wasn't going to touch it, but a name caught his eye. Regal Logistics, Inc., the vendor. Again. He flipped through the pages, fingers moving like he was diffusing something delicate. Shipping rates were inflated. Delivery logs fabricated. Approval initials looked copied. He closed the binder, jaw tight. This wasn't a mistake anymore. It was a scheme. But he didn't panic. He didn't rush into HR or scream fraud. He took a breath, wrote it down, and went back to work. That night, he sat with Alara on the couch. She was reading Le Petit Prince in French, her lips moving in gentle rhythm. "You ever wonder," he asked, "why people ignore things that seem wrong?" She didn't look up. Because if they see it, they have to do something about it. And if they can't, then they pretend it isn't there. But you're not good at pretending, Dad. He smiled, leaning back. She closed the book and turned to him. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet. But sometimes you don't need to change the world. You just need to be ready when the world asks you to." Back at Crystal Tech, Allison stood in her corner office, watching the city bleed into nightfall. The company was bleeding too, but quieter, in numbers, in trust, in things no investor presentation could mask forever. And yet, she couldn't put her finger on it. Not yet. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that somewhere in a storage closet downstairs, next to a shelf of floor wax and an old radio, a worn leather notebook held the truth. The numbers didn't scream. They whispered. And one janitor had been listening all along. The boardroom of Crystal Tech was designed to impress. Polished walnut table, wall-to-wall windows framing the city skyline, and a chandelier imported from Austria that dripped light like melting crystal. But today, the room wasn't about beauty. It was about blood. Allison stood at the head of the table, her spine straight, her lips set like carved marble. Her once commanding presence felt thinner now, like a flag in the wind. Across from her sat 12 men in tailored suits, members of her own board, eyes gleaming, not with support, but with the cold calculation of wolves circling a wounded leader. The screen behind her displayed a plunging red line. The stock had fallen 17% overnight. "It's temporary," Allison said, voice firm. "A market reaction, not a verdict." Charles Lindell, CFO, smirked. "Temporary?" His voice dripped with condescension. "Allison, we've lost $47 million in value in 2 days. That's not temporary. That's hemorrhaging." A few others nodded, some pretending to look sympathetic. Most didn't bother. "You've made bold bets," said another, Greg from legal. "Some would say reckless." "I've made visionary decisions," she snapped. "The same kind that built this company in the first place." "Visionary doesn't pay dividends?" Lindell muttered, flipping through a leather portfolio with mock interest. "Leadership does, which frankly is what this company seems to be lacking." Silence. Heavy, tactical. Then came the moment. "We've been talking," said Malcolm Trent, chairman of the board. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "And perhaps it's time to consider new leadership, a different direction, one with steadier hands." That was it. The coup, dressed in politeness, presented like a gentleman's handshake. But Allison felt it like a knife between her ribs. Her throat tightened, but she didn't flinch. Not yet. She opened her mouth, searching for the words that could pull this room back from its ledge. And that's when the door opened. It was a soft sound. A squeak, barely noticed in the tension-heavy air. But everyone turned. Harris, mop in hand, utility belt strapped to his waist, uniform faded from too many washes, boots silent on the plush carpet. He hadn't meant to interrupt. He had simply followed the schedule. Clean the boardroom at 10:15, just like every Friday. But now 12 men stared at him like he was a stain himself. Harris paused, surveying the room with that unhurried calm of someone who'd seen real wars, not corporate ones. "Sorry," he said evenly. "Didn't mean to intrude." "You are intruding," Lindell spat. "Get out." Allison opened her mouth to tell Harris it was fine, that he should go, but then something flickered in the janitor's eyes. Not defiance, not disrespect. Something cooler. Composure. Harris stepped forward slowly, mop still in hand. He looked at Allison, then turned toward the men who had just attempted to strip her throne. Then he said, voice low but clear, "Don't call it collapse. Not when she hasn't played her final card." The room stilled. Completely. Even the chandelier seemed to hold its breath. Lindell blinked. "Excuse me?" Harris looked at him, unfazed. "Markets fall. People panic. But power? Real power? It waits, and it hits when you least expect it." Greg scoffed. "You're a janitor. What the hell would you know about power?" Harris didn't blink. "More than you think." He looked at Allison again. There was no pity in his eyes, only respect. And then, without another word, he turned, wheeled his mop bucket out, and left the room in absolute silence, leaving behind 12 men, unsure whether they'd just been warned or witnessed. Down the hallway, Allison caught up to him. She didn't speak at first, just walked beside him as he wheeled the bucket down the corridor, the faint squeak of the wheels their only soundtrack. Finally, she said, "You have no idea what that meant in there." He glanced at her. "I think I do." "Why did you say it?" "Because truth doesn't care where it's spoken from." She studied him. "You always speak like that?" "Only when it matters." They reached the elevator. She pressed the button, but didn't look away from him. "Thank you." He gave a small nod, and then she asked, softly, "Do you believe I still have a card to play?" He turned to her, that same stillness in his gaze. "I don't believe," he said. "I know." The elevator doors opened. She stepped in, but before they closed, she whispered, "Stay close, Harris. I think I'm going to need you." Back in the boardroom, no one spoke for a full minute. Then Lindell chuckled nervously. "A janitor giving lectures now. This company's truly going to hell." Malcolm Trent didn't laugh. He stared at the door, deep in thought, because in that room, for the first time in weeks, someone had spoken with conviction, and it wasn't anyone sitting at the table. The storm hadn't passed. It simply went quiet. Allison sat in her office overlooking the city, the lights of crystal tech flickering across the glass walls like nervous heartbeats. The markets were still bleeding, the board still plotting, and her belief in miracles was thinning. Until a knock came. Soft. 3 taps. Rhythmic. Like someone who never hurried, even under fire. Harris stepped in. She didn't look up at first, just kept staring at the skyline. "You're early," she said. "I'm always early." He walked in, cleaner's belt still fastened around his waist, but there was something else in his hand. A small, black notebook worn around the edges, the kind used by people who didn't trust cloud storage. He set it down gently on her desk. "What's this?" she asked. "I've been looking at patterns," he said calmly, "in the backup data files, the ones stored on the cleaning server drives." She arched a brow. Why would janitors have access to data servers? He met her eyes, unfazed. "Because they hide them in the ceilings, and I've spent more time in the ceilings of this company than anyone on your payroll." That stopped her. He continued, "There's a data cluster that was flagged obsolete 2 years ago. It was never properly integrated when your firm merged with Convergent AI. But the valuation data in that cluster, it's off." "Off how?" "It lists a 1.4% equity stake in a quantum chip prototype labeled as scrapped R&D. She frowned. "That project was abandoned. Failed testing phase." "No," he said quietly. "It didn't fail. It was shelved and forgotten. But the IP was registered, accidentally, under a shared patent agreement with a startup called Hexanova. And 2 days ago, Hexanova was acquired by Astra Group for $73 billion. She blinked. "Wait, are you saying?" He nodded. "Crystal Tech still owns a sliver of that patent. A very valuable sliver." Silence. Harris stepped forward. "If you give me access to the investment analysis dashboard, I can locate the clause in the archive database. It'll take 3 seconds." Allison hesitated. "You're not an analyst, not even on staff." "I'm not asking for a desk, just the keyboard." There was something in his voice. Calm. Sure, not arrogance. Precision. She turned her screen toward him, typed in her passcode, and slid it across. He sat down. 3 seconds. Click, click, enter. Silence. Then, "There," he said, pointing to a highlighted clause. "Look at line 1734. The clause was never amended, which means your company holds rights to residual profits post-acquisition." Allison leaned in, breath catching. He scrolled. "And here's the kicker. Because the equity was misclassified as a liability, it was never leveraged. But if you reclassify it now, today, before the end of quarter filing, we gain how much?" she whispered. He looked up at her, his voice calm as dawn. 1 billion. Maybe more. 43 minutes later, the reclassification hit the market. Crystal Tech's stock, which had been plummeting for weeks, halted its descent. Then reversed. Buy orders flooded in. Algorithms reacted. Investment bots flagged the change as deep value resurgence. The stock price doubled in a single hour. Phones rang. Analysts blinked. News anchors rushed to update headlines mid-broadcast. And in the boardroom, the men who had called for Allison's removal sat frozen, their screens glowing with green arrows they could no longer understand. Allison didn't leave her office. She stood by the window as the world shifted outside. Behind her, Harris remained seated, silent, as the echo of his 3-second miracle unfolded. She turned to him slowly. Her eyes were glassy, not with fear, but with something softer. "Why did you help me?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Then softly, "Because you listened when no one else did." She looked down. "You could have walked away. Let me drown with the rest of them." "I've seen enough people drown," he said quietly. "Sometimes it takes one hand to break the surface." A pause. Then almost playfully she asked, "You sure you're just a janitor?" He smiled faintly. "No one's just anything." They stood in silence for a moment. Then, with tears brimming but voice steady, Allison said, "Thank you." Harris nodded once. "Use it wisely." She stared at him, searching for something in his eyes. But what she saw wasn't pride or victory. It was peace. Later that evening, in the modest apartment across town, Alara waited by the kitchen table. The lights were dim, and she was drawing something on a napkin with a fountain pen, far too elegant for a child, but it was a gift from her father, and she cherished it. When Harris walked in, she looked up with that knowing spark in her eyes. "You did it, didn't you?" she asked. He set his bag down, crouched to her level. "No," he said softly. "We did." She beamed. Then, handing him the napkin, she whispered, "I wrote her name in 9 languages because she should know how many hearts are watching her now." He unfolded the paper. Allison. Written in Mandarin, French, Hindi, Russian, Arabic, Spanish, Japanese, Korean, and English, each character perfect, each letter a promise. "Will she be okay?" Alara asked. Harris looked at his daughter. "She will," he said, "because sometimes the world just needs to be reminded what's already there." The grand atrium of Crystal Tech was never meant for history. It was meant for product launches, stockholder briefings, and catered luncheons no one remembered the next day. But on that morning, it was a cathedral of silence. Screens buzzed softly on the walls, blinking stock tickers showing the miracle everyone was still trying to process. Crystal Tech's overnight recovery, from the brink of collapse to the front page of every financial outlet in America. And at the center of it all, standing before the board and the entire company staff, was a man in a faded navy green shirt, still wearing a janitor's apron. Harris. His presence alone defied every narrative the company had built. No title, no pedigree, no corporate ladder climbed, just grit, grace, and 3 seconds that rewrote the fate of a billion-dollar empire. Allison stood beside him, no longer the ironclad CEO behind tinted glass, but a woman visibly changed. Her defenses lowered, her voice tender but clear. "I called for this meeting," she began, addressing the crowd, "to give you the truth." People shifted in their seats. Phones lifted discreetly to record. All of you know the numbers. But what you don't know is who gave them back to us. She turned slightly to face Harris. The room followed her gaze like a tide drawn by gravity. "This man," she continued, "was not on any roster, not in any leadership pipeline. No awards, no recognition. He was the one you walked past without seeing." A murmur rippled through the room. Allison's voice trembled, but she didn't stop. "He saw what none of us saw. He understood what none of us understood. And he gave us back something we didn't deserve. Hope." Her throat tightened. Her next words came like a confession whispered across a battlefield. "Harris, if I had to give up everything I have, every ounce of power, title, position, just to keep someone like you beside me?" She paused, her eyes locked on his. "I would do it in a heartbeat." The room froze. It wasn't a business pitch. It wasn't even a thank you. It was a proposal. Raw, human, unexpected. Someone dropped a coffee cup. No one moved to pick it up. Harris didn't flinch. He stood tall, his expression unreadable, but not cold. His eyes searched hers, not for theatrics, but for truth. And he found it. Still, he didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to the room. "I'm not a miracle," he said quietly. "I'm not some genius waiting to be discovered. I just didn't look away." Silence. "I was trained to see the thing no one else wants to look at. On the battlefield, that skill kept people alive. Here, it saved a company." He looked back at Allison. "And sometimes, the person who sees what others miss ends up seeing you." The tension cracked like glass under sunlight. Allison exhaled. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. It was the beginning of something real. Later that afternoon, the world caught up. The clip of Allison's speech went viral within hours. Social media lit up. CEO proposes to janitor who saved her company. Best plot twist of the decade. Who needs Netflix? Just watch Crystal Tech's real-life rom-com. I cried, and I don't even work in tech. But for Harris, the moment passed like any other. Back at home, he changed into his usual clothes, folded the apron, washed his hands. The world might have seen a legend, but Alara still just saw her dad. She met him at the door, waving her latest drawing, a stick-figure man in a janitor's outfit holding hands with a tall woman in heels, hearts above their heads, the word family scrawled underneath. "She likes you," Alara said knowingly. Harris smiled. "She doesn't even know me." Alara tilted her head. "That's not true. She saw what no one else saw." He looked at his daughter, the one who could speak 9 languages but always understood the heart best. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe she did." Across the city, in a penthouse office, Allison stood alone at the window. She had everything back. Her company, her legacy, her title. But all she could think about was the man who asked for none of it. Her assistant knocked. "Media wants another interview. CNBC, New York Times, Forbes. Tell them I'll get back to them," Allison said without turning. She stared at her reflection in the glass. "I'm not finished writing this story yet." The apartment was modest. Walls dressed in warm tones, a few watercolors taped up by tiny hands, the smell of something simple but comforting drifting from the kitchen. There was no grandeur, no catered elegance. Just a table for 3, set with mismatched plates and a vase of hand-picked daisies. Allison sat across from Harris, uncertain, almost self-conscious without the armor of boardrooms and security detail. To her left, nestled in a small wooden chair, was Alara. The girl had her father's eyes, calm, observant, but there was a brightness in her, a quiet wisdom that flickered just beneath her innocent curiosity. She wore a white cotton dress, smudged with paint near the hem, and had a habit of tilting her head when she asked questions, as though truly listening for the answer. "Thank you for having me," Allison said, her voice softer than usual. "You're welcome," Alara beamed. "You're the first grown-up from his work to ever come over." Harris chuckled from the kitchen as he brought over a pan of baked macaroni and cheese. "Not exactly Crystal Tech catering," he joked. "It smells better," Allison replied, and meant it. They began to eat, and conversation eased in naturally. Alara talked about her favorite books, mostly in languages Allison didn't know. French poetry, Italian riddles, even a Mandarin proverb or 2. "She's extraordinary," Allison said, glancing at Harris. "She's just Alara," he replied, but Alara tilted her head. "Daddy says I'm a mirror. I only reflect what's around me." Allison smiled gently. "Then you must be surrounded by something very special." The dinner continued with laughter, questions, and the kind of joy that doesn't require effort, just presence. Allison, used to 5-course deals and corporate gala masks, found herself savoring spoonfuls of simplicity. Then, as the plates emptied and silence settled like a gentle dusk, Alara looked up from her chair and asked the question. "Miss Allison," she said, voice quiet but direct, "have you ever looked at someone with your heart?" Allison blinked. "With my heart?" Alara nodded. "Not just your eyes, not just because they're strong or rich or look like movie stars. I mean really looked." The question hung in the room, heavier than it should have been. Allison set down her fork. I'm not sure." Alara's gaze didn't waver. "Because I think, if you did, you'd see the way I see Daddy." Harris shifted, clearing his throat, but he said nothing. This was her moment. Alara leaned closer, her fingers tracing patterns in the condensation of her glass. "Other people say he's just a janitor," she continued, "or a soldier who left the war behind. But when he makes tea for me after nightmares, when he walks me to school, even though his knees hurt from old battles, when he looks at me like I'm his whole world, that's when I know. He's the most beautiful person I've ever seen." She looked up at Allison, not with innocence, but clarity. "Maybe you don't think he's handsome like on TV," she added, "but I think the eyes of your heart would say something else." Allison felt something stir, deep, unexpected, a tear that didn't fall, but warmed the corner of her eye. She looked at Harris, who looked away. This wasn't the man who saved her company. This was the man who saved his daughter, every day, in invisible ways. "I think," Allison said slowly, "you might be right." Alara smiled. It wasn't pride, it was peace, like she had given something that needed to be said. After dessert, just store-bought cookies and milk, Harris walked Allison to the door. The night air was cool, the kind that makes you want to linger. She's something, Allison said. She's everything, Harris replied. They stood quietly. I didn't expect this, Allison admitted. This feeling. What feeling? He asked gently. That maybe the strongest people don't always wear armor. He nodded once. Sometimes, he said, armor keeps the right people out. A long beat passed. Thank you, she said, for dinner and for letting me see your world. You've only seen the front door, he said with a faint smile. The rest takes time. Allison met his gaze. No boardroom, no spotlight, no stocks, just two hearts speaking quietly in the hallway. I'm willing, she whispered. And Harris, ever the soldier, ever the janitor, just nodded. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he felt it more than words could carry. The desert never really leaves you. That's what Harris used to say, to himself mostly. Long after he had scrubbed the last floor and tucked Alara into bed with one of her multilingual lullabies, the heat, the noise, the silence of war still crept through the cracks in his sleep. That night, Crystal Tech's tower blinked like a beacon behind them. Allison had walked Harris home after a late meeting. It was a reversal of roles she hadn't planned, but it felt natural, like they were both shedding old skins. The sky above was bruised with stars. A quiet wind chased dust along the sidewalk. Inside his apartment, Harris didn't offer tea or small talk. Instead, he handed her something, a worn wooden box. No lock, no key, just time. Open it, he said simply. She hesitated, then did. Inside were medals, not polished, not displayed, just kept. Allison looked at him. You never mentioned, he shook his head, because they don't mean what you think. He sat down on the edge of the couch, elbows on knees, fingers knotted. The soldier in him still sat like a man ready to spring. I was deployed 3 times, he began, voice gravel thick. First tour, I lost my best friend. Second tour, I lost the part of me that used to believe in orders without questions. Third, he trailed off. Allison didn't rush him. He looked up, eyes dark with memory. Third, I saved a man who didn't deserve it. One of ours, a captain. He got ambushed, left bleeding in a ditch. I carried him through sniper fire, 3 miles to a medevac. Took 2 bullets in the leg doing it. You saved him? Allison asked softly. I did, Harris said. And 6 months later, he sent the unit's only medic into a minefield on a calculated risk. That medic was 19. He didn't walk out. Allison covered her mouth. Oh, God. He got promoted, Harris added. Commendations? TV interviews? I sent in my resignation the same day. Dat. The room was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator. I stopped believing in titles, he said, in the idea that rank made a man worthy. That's why when I came back, I didn't want a corner office. I wanted peace, something I could build with my hands. And Alara, she asked. Her mom passed when she was a baby. I raised her alone. She's the only reason I got out of bed some days. Allison felt the pressure build behind her ribs. She had spent her life around men who chased legacy through empire, and here, in front of her, sat a man who had walked through hell, only to ask for nothing but decency and silence. She once asked me, Harris said, why I never fought for a higher position. I told her, sometimes being invisible is safer, until it's not. He paused. You know why I kept mopping those halls every night? Because it gave you peace, Allison offered. He shook his head. Because I knew someday someone would need help, not from the top of a ladder, but from the ground floor, where the truth lives. That's when Allison broke. She didn't sob. She didn't wail. She just cried, quietly, deeply, as if something in her had finally cracked open, not from weakness, but from witnessing something unbearably pure. She knelt in front of him, like the medals did not matter, like the stories were sacred. I've met kings, she whispered, but none of them ever made me believe the way you do. He looked at her, startled. I thought I was strong because I never cried, she continued, but maybe real strength is when you finally can. They didn't speak for a long time after that, just 2 people, one broken open, the other quietly whole, because he had built himself again from ashes. Later, when Allison stood to leave, she didn't look at him like a CEO. She looked at him like a woman who had seen the soul behind the silence. "Harris," she said at the door, "what would you have become if that war hadn't taken so much from you?" He smiled faintly. "I became a father," he said. "That's more than enough." She left without another word, but something had changed in her gait. She walked like someone who had found a truth worth carrying. "And Harris?" He closed the wooden box, not because the past was done with him, but because for the first time he felt ready to write a new chapter, one that didn't begin with loss, but with someone who had finally listened. It began with a knock that never came. The envelope was slid under the door like a shadow, silent but weighted, heavier than it looked, though it bore no markings but a discreet watermark, the insignia of Virelon Holdings, Crystal Tech's fiercest rival. Harris found it late that night, after tucking Alara into bed with her usual question about the stars and her quiet good night in Portuguese, one of 5 languages she preferred for dreams. He sat at the kitchen table under the soft light of the worn pendant lamp and opened the envelope. Inside, a letter on thick parchment. No pleasantries, no introduction. Just this: "We've been watching. What you did in 3 seconds saved $1 billion. Imagine what you could do with our systems, our backing, our resources. We're prepared to offer a starting position as Executive Strategic Director. 7 figures. Global relocation. Full discretion. You will never have to mop another floor again. Just say the word. M." There was a second page. Figures, bonuses, equity offers. They didn't even try to hide the seduction. It wasn't just money. It was escape. Power. A throne built in silence, away from the glare of Crystal Tech's spotlight. Harris read it once, folded it, then unfolded it again. He didn't know that, from the hallway, a quiet set of eyes had seen him. Alara stood barefoot, small arms wrapped around her sketchpad, clutching it like a shield. Her curls fell messily over one eye, and she didn't speak right away. Her gaze landed on the paper, on the numbers, on her father's expression, calm, unreadable, as always. But she had learned to read what was beneath the surface. She had been doing that since she was 4. "Are you going to take it?" she finally asked, voice barely above a whisper. Harris looked up, startled. "Elle," he said gently, "it's late. I saw the number, Dad." She stepped forward, laying her sketchpad on the table beside the letter. On the page was a drawing, a figure holding a giant coin in one hand and a small heart in the other. The coin was massive, flashy, but the figure had dropped their head, shoulders slumped. "What are you saying?" Harris asked softly. "I'm saying," Alara sat beside him now, swinging her feet above the floor, "you always tell me to choose what's right over what's easy. You say the world doesn't need more rich people. It needs more good ones." He smiled faintly. "Do I really sound like that?" She nodded, then added with the seriousness only a 9-year-old could summon. "You sound cooler in Italian?" He chuckled, but then his eyes returned to the letter. Alara leaned closer. "Would this make us move away?" "Maybe." "Would you stop working at Crystal Tech?" He hesitated. "Yes." She was quiet again, processing. Then came the question, not a challenge, but something deeper. "Would you still be you?" Silence. He didn't answer. Instead, Harris reached into the drawer, pulled out a matchbox, and walked over to the old ceramic fireplace in the corner of their modest living room. He knelt, lit a small flame, and without drama, without a word, placed the letter into the fire. Alara stood beside him, watching the paper curl into smoke. The numbers turned to black ash. The offer dissolved into silence. She took his hand. "You didn't answer," she said. "I didn't have to." That night, as he tucked her in again, Alara whispered in Spanish, "Gracias por quedarte tú." "Thank you for staying you." He kissed her forehead. "Siempre." Always. What Harris didn't know was that a message was already moving. Earlier that afternoon, a Crystal Tech junior associate named Jordan, an analyst with more curiosity than protocol, had intercepted a trace on an unusual corporate probe. The name Harris came up. Virellon Holdings had flagged him under critical watch. Or the next morning, Allison stormed into her office, holding the printed trace. They tried to poach him? She was more furious than she'd expected, not just because Virellon had the audacity, but because she hadn't even considered how easy it would have been for Harris to say yes. She called him in. He entered the room, like always, calm, quiet, still wearing the faded janitor's uniform, the same one she had grown to respect like armor. "Did you get an offer?" she asked directly. "Yes." "You didn't tell me." "You didn't ask." "Why didn't you take it?" He met her eyes, unwavering. "Because some things can't be bought." Allison's voice softened. "And what are those things?" "Conviction, integrity, my daughter's respect." She swallowed. "May I ask what you did with the offer?" "I burned it," he said, right in front of her. That was the moment something inside Allison shifted forever. Not because of what he turned down, but because of what he chose to protect. She walked around the desk, stood right in front of him. "You're not invisible here anymore, Harris. I never needed to be seen. But now," she said, voice low but certain, "the world needs to see you." The internal memo was short. No subject line, no signature. "All staff, please gather in the atrium at 4 p.m. sharp. Attendance required." That was it. No fanfare, no explanation. Just a whisper that swept through Crystal Tech like a breeze before a storm. At precisely 4 p.m., the elevators dinged on every floor. Engineers, coders, assistants, executives, everyone shuffled into the tall glass atrium that bathed in golden afternoon light. Conversations buzzed with curiosity. Some suspected another product announcement. Others, a corporate restructure. No one expected what came next. At the center of the space, a single microphone stood on a small, unadorned platform. And beside it, Allison Quinn. No bodyguards, no podium. Just the CEO, in her signature navy blazer, her hands clasped in front of her like she wasn't a leader speaking to employees, but a human speaking to humans. She didn't greet. She didn't smile. She began. 3 weeks ago, this company was on the edge of financial collapse. That's not an exaggeration. That's not a headline. That's the truth. A hush spread like wildfire. We were misled, misdirected. Our data was compromised and our decisions manipulated. And while a room full of experts debated analytics, projections, and damage control, one person simply noticed. She paused, not because he was paid to, not because it was his job, but because, in his words, you don't walk past wrong and still call yourself right. The crowd stirred. Allison looked toward the back of the room. "Harris," she said gently, "will you join me?" Heads turned. From the very edge of the gathering, a man stepped forward, still in his faded janitor uniform. Still calm, unhurried. He didn't carry the air of someone used to attention, more like someone who'd been quietly avoiding it his whole life. As he walked, silence fell fully. No whispers now, only respect. Allison extended her hand. Harris shook it, reluctantly, sincerely, and stood beside her. "I didn't ask his permission to do this," she said, smiling faintly, "because I knew he'd say no." A few soft chuckles. "I also knew that if we keep building a world where humility gets buried and ego gets rewarded, we'll lose not just companies, but humanity." She turned slightly toward Harris. "This man found the glitch in our valuation models. He prevented an implosion. He saved billions. And when I asked how he did it so quickly, he said, 'I've cleaned the floor beneath that server room for 2 years. I memorized its heartbeat.'" A stunned silence, followed by slow, spontaneous applause. It grew, louder, richer, not corporate clapping, real, thunderous gratitude. Harris raised his hand slightly. The room quieted. "I didn't do it for applause," he said, voice quiet but resonant. "And I don't want a new title or a fancy office. I want a culture where everyone gets to see what's beneath them, as something worth paying attention to." He looked around the room. Some people had tears in their eyes. "I'll keep cleaning," he said, "until this place shines the way it's supposed to." The applause came again, this time standing, this time uncontainable. Allison stepped forward once more. Her eyes were glassy. "We have a new internal motto," she said. "One we'll place in every hallway, in every handbook, in every onboarding session from this day forward." She turned to the massive digital screen behind her. The words appeared, white on black. "Greatness never wears a name tag." "Harris." The room erupted. Some people cheered. Some stood silent, hands over hearts. But no one, absolutely no one, looked at Harris as just the cleaner ever again. Later that evening, when the building had emptied and the buzz had faded, Harris returned to his usual routine. Mop, bucket, silent footsteps on marble floors. Alara walked beside him, wearing her oversized school hoodie, humming a melody she'd made up. "Did you like what she said?" she asked suddenly. "I liked that people listened," he replied. "Were you proud?" Harris looked at her. "I was proud when you hugged me afterward." She beamed. "You know what you sounded like up there?" "What?" "A superhero. But like, the quiet kind. The ones that don't wear capes. The ones that sweep." He smiled, bending to rinse the mop. Alara twirled in the middle of the lobby, arms out. "They'll probably want to put you on the news now. Make a movie. You know, The Man Who Cleaned His Way to $1 billion. Or something like that." He laughed. "Sounds exhausting." "Too famous?" "Too far from the ground." She paused. "Is that why you stay?" He nodded. "Because truth doesn't shout. It just shows up." Alara stood still for a moment, then took her father's hand. "Then I want to be someone who shows up, too." Harris looked down at her, and in her eyes he didn't see a future millionaire, or genius, or even a polyglot. He saw the very thing he had built his entire life to protect, a human being who understood value, not in currency, but in character. Together they walked into the quiet hum of the atrium. A janitor, a little girl, and behind them, on a wall of light, the words remained, "Greatness never wears a name tag." And perhaps for the first time in its history, Crystal Tech finally began to look clean. It didn't happen all at once. Culture never does. It starts in glances, in held doors, in cups of coffee left on someone's desk without a note, in the small, almost invisible acknowledgments that someone matters. At Crystal Tech, those moments had been absent for years, replaced by ego, pressure, and silent corridors where kindness felt like weakness. But something was changing. It began in the break room. Harris was pouring hot water over a tea bag, same as he always did, when Alan, one of the junior data analysts who used to avoid eye contact, walked in. He hesitated, then offered a nod. "Sir," Alan said awkwardly, I just wanted to say thank you." Harris raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For staying when you didn't have to," he replied. "For showing us what integrity actually looks like." The man who once pretended Harris was invisible now stood awkwardly, hands in his hoodie pocket, as if unsure whether to bow or shake hands. Harris smiled and extended a hand. "No thanks needed," he said, "but I appreciate it." The handshake was firm, honest, and it echoed. In the weeks that followed the day Harris was honored, something remarkable unfolded. People who once scoffed now paused. The security guard at the parking entrance, who used to wave Harris through like he was part of the background, now greeted him each morning with a salute and a "good to see you, sir." The executives who had once dismissed Harris's presence as irrelevant began stopping him in the hallways, not to compliment, but to ask questions, sincere ones. "Do you think we're hiring the right kind of thinkers? What would you change in our employee training? What would you do differently? If you were us?" And each time, Harris gave the same kind of answer, direct, humble, grounded. "I'd start by listening to people you don't usually listen to." But it wasn't just Harris who planted these seeds. It was Alara. Her father's integrity had made headlines. And while Harris declined interviews and refused every offer of fame, Alara did something else. She started teaching. Every Wednesday at 5 p.m., in a small, unused conference room on the 14th floor, she arranged chairs in a circle, printed worksheets, brought her own crayons and flashcards, and waited. At first, no one came. Then one woman did, Rosa, a Venezuelan janitor who'd worked for the night shift 5 years straight without a raise because she couldn't pass the basic English test required for promotion. Alara handed her a worksheet and said softly, "Let's start with the words you already know." By the end of that month, there were 6 students, 3 janitors, 1 cafeteria cook, a delivery driver, and a security guard. People whose names had rarely been spoken in Crystal Tech's tower now sat every week with a 9-year-old who treated them like royalty. Alara didn't just teach them English. She taught them confidence, and they brought food, tacos, dumplings, homemade bread. One woman crocheted a pink hat for Alara and called her Mi Profesora Milagrosa, my miracle teacher. Harris would peek into the room sometimes and watch from the door. "You always stay late," he told her one night. She looked up from her flashcards. "You always did too," he chuckled. Touché. Word spread. And then it happened, the kind of change no memo could mandate. People began helping without being asked. A programmer noticed an error in someone else's code and fixed it, not to claim credit, but because it needed to be right. A marketing manager donated her bonus to cover the night staff's uniform upgrades. A CFO postponed a vacation to personally review the hiring procedures for immigrant workers, realizing they were riddled with unfair language barriers. Crystal Tech didn't become perfect, but it became awake. The whisper of dignity had become a rhythm. One morning, Allison stepped into the elevator and saw something that stopped her cold. The executive who once called Harris background noise was now walking alongside him, carrying the mop bucket, laughing, talking. "Do you want me to alert the media?" Harris teased. "Don't ruin this moment for me." The man grinned. Allison didn't say a word. She just watched and understood. The rain had come. The soil had taken it in. Now the seeds, long dormant beneath concrete culture, were blooming. That afternoon, Allison called for a redesign of the main lobby. She ordered the old corporate mission statement plaque removed. In its place, she commissioned a new installation, a low bronze sculpture of an open hand, palm upward, and engraved into the base the words, "True value isn't declared, it's lived. Anonymous janitor." She didn't use Harris's name because he wouldn't have wanted her to. That evening, as father and daughter walked home beneath the soft lavender hues of the setting sun, Alara skipped a step ahead. "Did you know Rosa got promoted?" she asked. Harris looked at her. "She earned it. And Mr. Tran said he might start his own food delivery app. In 3 languages. Harris smiled. "That's ambition." Alara stopped, turned to him. "Do you think they changed because of us?" Harris knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No," he said gently. "They changed because someone finally saw the good that was always inside them." She nodded, considering that. "So, it's like the rain didn't make the seeds. It just gave them a chance to grow." "Exactly." She took his hand. "Then let's keep being the rain." Behind them, the city pulsed with light. But somewhere, inside that glass tower, among the shimmering offices and automated elevators and million-dollar decisions, kindness had taken root. And for the first time in years, it was growing wild. The river shimmered like glass beneath the golden blush of twilight. Soft ripples caught the final kiss of sun, scattering fragments of light across the water's surface. The city, just beyond the bend, hummed in distant tones, a quiet contrast to the stillness along the secluded riverbank. Harris stood near the edge, hands in his worn military jacket, gaze steady on the horizon, not waiting, not expecting, just being, as he always did, a man of grounded presence. Behind him, Alara sat cross-legged on a smooth rock, a small wooden flute to her lips. The notes she played weren't technical or rehearsed. They came from somewhere within, pure, honest, childlike in beauty. Each melody floated across the evening air like a whisper of something timeless. And a few paces away, Allison watched them both. No boardroom, no security detail, no tailored suits, just a woman, bare, brave, and breathing in the kind of peace she didn't know she'd ever find again. She carried nothing but a small folded blanket and the courage of someone who no longer feared rejection, not because she was confident, but because she had finally learned what truly mattered. "Elara," she said gently. The little girl stopped playing and turned, smiling. "Hi, Miss Allison." "Beautiful music," Allison said. Elara shrugged playfully. "It's not perfect." Allison knelt and spread the blanket. "The best things rarely are." Harris turned at the sound of their voices, a soft smile creasing his weathered face. "You found our spot." Allison nodded. "I asked Elara to show me. She said it was where the wind tells the truth." Harris chuckled. "She gets poetic after ice cream." "Or maybe," Allison said as she sat beside him, "she just gets it from you." They sat together in silence for a while, not uncomfortable, but sacred. Words were no longer the bridge between them. Presence was. Elara resumed her flute, a gentle lull of tones that wrapped around them like a blanket of sound. Allison inhaled deeply, eyes fixed on the horizon. Then, without turning, she spoke. "I meant it." Harris looked at her. "Meant what?" "That day, in the boardroom. What I said." He was quiet for a moment. Then softly, "I know. But this time," she added, finally turning to meet his gaze, "I'm not saying it in front of cameras, or executives, or under pressure. This time it's just us. Just me, and you, and her." Her eyes drifted to Elara, who was humming now, lost in her own little world. Allison's voice lowered, reverent. "I don't have fairy tale promises to offer, Harris. No fireworks, no white dresses. I've lived enough to know life isn't made of grand gestures. It's made of quiet courage, daily grace, and someone to walk home with when the world doesn't make sense." She paused, then added, "I don't want to be rescued, and I know you're done being everyone's hero, but I want to wake up every day next to a man my daughter could point to and say, that's what strength looks like. Not in medals, not in money, but in how he listens, how he shows up." Harris didn't move, didn't flinch, but something in his breath softened. "I've had offers before," he said finally. "High-paying jobs, titles, even a few desperate pleas in drunken bars." Allison smiled. "This isn't that." "No," he said. "It's not." His eyes met hers, and this time he didn't look away. "I don't know what love is supposed to look like anymore," he confessed. "I've lost too much, seen too many versions of it go wrong. But I know what peace feels like when I sit beside you. I know what pride feels like when she calls you by your name." He glanced at Elara again. "She told me yesterday that your laugh sounds like home." Allison blinked hard, her breath catching. "I don't need a title either, Harris," she whispered. "Not wife, not partner, not CEO. I just need us, in whatever form you'll allow." There was a long pause, and then Harris reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper, worn, faded, something carried for years. He handed it to her without a word. She unfolded it. It was a drawing. Crude, childlike, done in colored pencil. A stick figure man holding hands with a smaller girl. And beside them, a tall woman drawn in bright blue ink with wild hair and a sun above her head. Underneath, scrawled in Elara's handwriting, "My family, but she doesn't know it yet." Allison let out a soft laugh through a tear. Harris finally said, "She made that 3 months ago." "She knew before either of us did," Allison whispered. "I think she's always known." They sat, quiet again, as the sun dipped lower and the first stars began to poke through the velvet sky. Then Elara looked up and called, "Daddy, can we teach Miss Allison how to skip stones?" Harris stood, offered his hand to Allison, and as she rose beside him, her fingers entwined with his, she knew. This wasn't the kind of proposal that came with diamonds or kneeling on one knee. It was stronger than that. It was a proposal of presence, of promises made not with words, but with years ahead, full of patience, trust, and quiet, relentless love. And it was exactly what she'd been waiting for her whole life. The office looked nothing like it did a year ago. Gone were the sterile corporate whites and rigid corners. Now, soft amber light filtered through tall windows draped in linen. A faint scent of cedar lingered in the air, not overpowering, just enough to feel like someone lived here, not just worked. At the far end of the room stood a solid walnut desk, modest in size, smooth to the touch, and hanging behind it, framed in simple wood, was a single object, an old janitor's apron. Worn, frayed at the edges, still faintly stained from nights spent scrubbing marble hallways long after the world had gone to sleep. It wasn't there for show. It was there as a reminder. Harris sat behind the desk, sleeves rolled up, fingers tapping quietly on a spreadsheet. His posture was relaxed, not authoritative. The door to his office was slightly ajar, as it always was, a silent invitation. He still refused a title. He still brewed his own coffee. And yes, on most mornings, he still wore the apron. Not out of nostalgia, but because it centered him, kept him rooted in something deeper than success, purpose. A gentle knock came at the door. It creaked open wider, and Alara poked her head in, her backpack slung haphazardly over one shoulder, a folded paper clutched in her hand. "Do you have 5 minutes?" "For you?" Harris smiled. "Always." She walked in, all grace and energy, now a step taller than the year before, but still the same observant spark in her eyes. "I finished my school essay," she said, placing the folded sheet on the desk. "It's due tomorrow." He reached for it. "Want me to read it now?" She hesitated. "Only if you're okay. Crying a little?" He chuckled. "Is that a warning or a promise?" "A little of both," she grinned. He opened the paper. The title at the top, written in careful blue ink, read, "The Man Who Never Bowed His Head." Most people think heroes wear suits or uniforms. Mine wore a janitor's apron. My father used to mop floors late into the night, but he never once looked small. He never spoke loud, but somehow people leaned in to listen. He taught me that dignity is not about status. It's about how you carry your silence, how you treat others when no one's watching. Some say he saved $1 billion company, but I think the real miracle was that he saved people, not just with his skills, but with his kindness, with his eyes. People used to walk past him like he was invisible. Now they open doors when he walks by. But here's the truth. He was always that man. The world just took a while to see it. By the end, Harris had indeed gone quiet, not because he was holding back tears, but because something in his chest, that part of a man rarely spoken to, was full. Alara stood beside him, watching his reaction with those steady, soulful eyes. "Was it okay?" she asked softly. Harris didn't answer with words. Instead, he rose from his chair, walked around the desk, and wrapped her in a quiet, strong hug. She buried her face in his chest. Neither of them needed to say it. This moment would stay with them forever. That weekend, Allison read the essay during a company retreat, not on a stage, not with cameras, just around a small fire pit with employees gathered in mismatched chairs, sipping cocoa under the stars. When she finished reading, the silence was absolute, thick, reverent. And then slowly, someone clapped. Then another, then everyone. But not for applause. It was gratitude, for being reminded that quiet strength still mattered, that goodness wasn't just a relic, it could still lead. A few months later, a quiet room on the top floor of Crystal Tech headquarters was converted into what they called the listening room. No fancy tech, no titles, just a circle of chairs, a shelf of books, and a single plaque on the wall. It read, "Behind this quiet door once stood a man who mopped our floors and lifted our standards. He asked for no reward, but he left us all richer. May we always remember that character is not the absence of flaws, but the presence of light that refuses to go out." Harris never officially retired. He just started showing up less, because the people he mentored had taken over, not just his role, but his values. And that to him was the real success. One rainy afternoon, years later, a young intern paused in front of the framed apron in the hallway. She turned to the receptionist nearby and asked, "Who was he?" The receptionist smiled. "Depends who you ask. Some say he was a janitor. Others say he was a genius. But me?" She paused. I say he was the first person who ever looked me in the eye and asked if I was okay and meant it. In the end, Harris never became a CEO, but he became something rarer, a symbol, not of perfection, but of quiet excellence, the kind that doesn't shout but echoes. And in a world that often forgets the power of humility, his story didn't fade like a fairy tale. It stayed, in essays, in memory, and in that soft, steady light glowing behind the quiet door. A light called dignity, and it never went out. Where are you watching this from? We'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from today. Feel free to share in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, inspired a thought, or simply brought a moment of quiet peace, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the next chapter in our journey together. Thank you so much for watching. Your time means the world to us. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and take good care of yourself.